Cyberpunk 2077 is out. We've already looked at the PC version. We've looked at the PlayStation 4 version. But the story they tell is very different. It's extremely impressive on the PC side, a whole lot less so on the console. But what if you own a next-gen system? Well, that's something we wanted to look at because currently the actual next-gen update is not available for Cyberpunk for PS5, Series X, or S. But there are actually significant enhancements and improvements to those versions of the game. So I guess the question is, which one is best? To discuss that, though, I am joined by the one and only Richard Leadbetter.
Pleasure to be here, John. An absolutely fascinating topic because fundamentally we don't actually have a next generation version of Cyberpunk 2077 for consoles at all. So the new hardware here is basically leveraging backwards compatibility features across the board. And there's much more variation than I thought we would see, I guess.
Yeah, so here's the thing. From what I understand, it is possible for last generation games to be aware that they're running on a new console. And I think that's exactly what's happened, as there are special modes available to take advantage of the extra hardware. Specifically, like, PlayStation 5. The 30 FPS cap is gone. It now targets 60 FPS. Xbox Series X is 60 and 30, and depending on which mode you choose. And then, of course, there is the S, which we'll talk about. I say let's begin with the image quality. And this is a tricky one because in most modes, the resolution is pretty low and the TAA is extremely aggressive. So honestly, when you look at the console version here, it's pretty blurry. My suggestion, though, right away, turn off chromatic aberration and film grain. I normally don't mind these effects, but they're very strong here. And with the TAA, it creates a very blurry looking game. So that's the first thing I would do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But once we look at the individual consoles, where do you want to start? PS5 or Xbox?
I think PlayStation 5 is probably the simpler one to address, so let's begin there.
Sure. So basically, PS5 has one mode, and it runs basically at 60 frames per second, though with some caveats that we'll get to. And it seems to use the same basic settings as PS4 Pro, which means from all of my pixel counts, it pretty much tops out at 1188p, which is 55% of a 4K image. But there are occasional dips below this, like in one scene we got 21 out of 40 steps instead of the typical 22, and this was a scene with slowdown, so it makes sense. But in general, the image seems to hang at 1188p, which isn't especially high for the type of TAA they have, so the game is blurry on PS5.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, this is actually, it is leveraging the PlayStation 4 Pro setup. I think Tom measured 972p to 1188p there on the dynamic range, but obviously PlayStation 5, not only is it doubling the frame rate, more than that really, in the stress points, it's also, it's mostly running at the top end of the DRS range.
Precisely. And then on the Xbox side, this one's interesting. First of all, it has a quality mode. Frame rate's capped at 30, and the resolution is bumped up. The HUD as well is entirely in high resolution. This one seems to range primarily between, say, 1512p and 1728p, but I suspect it can go a little higher or a little lower depending on what's going on. But it is the best image quality you can currently get on consoles, and it's more what you would expect from, well, I guess, the One X or the PS4 Pro last gen. But you get it here on Series X. Now, I haven't actually seen the One X version, so I'm actually curious to see what that has going on in there, but we'll talk about that soon.
Well, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because Tom's already done the PlayStation 4 Pro and PS4 analysis, and he's now moving on to the Xbox and One X analysis, whereas we've kind of skipped ahead to PlayStation 5 and Series SX, which will be effectively covering the work that he's looking at now, but we're looking at it with effectively, much more horsepower being deployed to run the same game, basically.
So on performance mode then, this one seems to max out at 1080p as far as I can tell. At least all the counts I did, always 1080p, occasionally a little bit under, but I wasn't able to find any instances of it going above. Maybe looking at the sky, but even then, didn't trigger. So image quality in performance mode on Series X is actually worse than PS5, but only by a hair. It's a very similar pixel count. Now, Series S is kind of the interesting one because it actually has some advantages over PS5 and Xbox Series X in performance mode in that it can go above 1080p. The highest I counted was like 1296p or so, and it can of course go lower than that and lower than 1080p in some instances. It seems this game is really hard to pixel count, it should be noted, due to the TAA. But yeah, so you kind of get a better than 1080p presentation. But it still has that low-res, grainy look that you get with the performance modes. Like, this game just doesn't work very well at the lower resolutions, I feel. But it gets even more interesting when we move into the visual side. On PS5, it seems to inherit settings from the PS4 version, which is why, it's missing a lot of the details. Things are kind of pulled back. The crowds are reduced. You can see a lot of the lighting draw in. It's not great. I mean, the thing about this is, coming from the PC version, which is where I played the game mostly, it's it's not ugly, but it's a huge step down. But Xbox has it a little better, specifically in quality mode. And this is actually, if you want the best looking visuals on console, this is where I'm going to say you should go, and I'll tell you why. Obviously, you get a higher resolution with a 30 FPS cap, but some things obviously seem to scale with that. So like reflections, texture filtering, the volumetric fog, a lot of the post-processing, all of this stuff is cleaner and better looking when running in higher resolution, so that's nice. Also, the quality mode adds nice ambient occlusion, which you can see here. This is missing from the performance mode on Xbox and missing from PS5. And weirdly enough, one of the big things I noticed is that the crowd density is higher on Xbox.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? I mean, obviously, Microsoft did have that marketing deal with CD Projekt RED. There was a bespoke Xbox One X console modeled around Cyberpunk 2077. So I guess maybe there was some compulsion to do something a little bit extra for that machine. So that's why we've got these two modes.
Yeah.
But it pays off, really, doesn't it? I mean, essentially, we've got two choices here. Well, three. You've got the performance and quality mode, which is, some interesting choices there. We'll talk about the performance in a bit. But, yeah, I think you're right in that the image quality greatly benefits from having additional resolution. But then again, on PlayStation 5, we only have the PS4 Pro feature set, but with the unlocked frame rate. So, yeah, interesting choices for users who might have access to both consoles here.
And thinking of that as well, I mean, we also have to consider that the next gen updates are on the way. Who knows when it'll arrive, but right now you're just buying the game for as it is, but it will improve. So we'll see how that goes when we get there. I will say Series S receives some of the quality mode boosts, at least. So stuff like ambient occlusion, for instance, is actually active on Series S, where you don't get that in the performance modes on either console. So I thought that was kind of cool. In fact, Series S seems to be using the quality mode from Series X, but just targeting lower resolutions.
Yeah, I think I'd characterize my time with Cyberpunk on Series S as absolutely fine.
Yeah.
It's actually a really good version of the game. It's just, no fuss. Just delivers it delivers what you kind of would have hoped to have seen on the last gen machines, a consistent experience. It doesn't look anything like the PC version, but then again, there's going to be PC users out there who won't be experiencing the game.
That's true.
Like we have.
I think it's really important to look at that. You look at the Series S version, you kind of think like, this is, I think, what users would have expected from the last gen consoles.
Yep.
A stable 30 frames per second, as we'll see, not a bad thing. Now, I guess that's where we should jump into performance. As I said, the last gen consoles have a really, really rough time with this game. I haven't seen the numbers for Xbox One yet. I have actually seen a couple frame rate graphs for the regular Xbox One, and it doesn't look good either. But the PS4 systems really turn in horrible numbers. The frame rate dips below 20 a lot, which is bad. But thankfully, PS5 You start that up, and the impression you get is very, very different. In fact, the entire introduction sequence is 100% locked at 60 frames per second. I mean, just right there, you're like, okay, this is a very different thing. But it's not completely locked. So driving through the city here, you will notice some dips into the 50s on PS5. And again, I haven't played that far yet, but based on what I can tell and knowing how the PC version behaves and how driving around is so expensive, this is probably the worst it gets. And I gather that the moments where it dips under 60 here on the PS5 are the moments where it dips under 20 on PS4 Pro.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So it kind of gives us some insight into the way it scales in backwards compatibility mode.
Yeah, I'd love to see the head-to-heads on that. I might well look into that myself, because we've yet to be able to measure the multiplier, the GPU multiplier between PS4 Pro and PlayStation 5, and it sounds like we could actually do it here. But then again, if the bottleneck is driving, that kind of says to me that we're looking at a CPU limitation, because, you know, when you're driving at speed, the stress that's put on the decompression and streaming systems is pretty intense. I mean, we've seen it before. I mean, our entire CPU benchmark for The Witcher 3 is based around stressing the background streaming systems. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that is a CPU limitation there. But yeah, I am interested in seeing those head-to-heads in the fullness of time. But I think, you know, by and large, most of the time it's 60 on PlayStation 5, right?
Yeah, I mean, you get into combat, you go up to dudes on the street, start opening up on them, or, you know, during the missions, all that stuff. Like, it's pretty much just a locked 60 FPS. So even though the image quality suffers, it actually feels really good to play most of the time. And it's such a leap from the other console versions that you're just like, all right, like I could put up with the hit here while waiting for the next gen patch, because yeah, it feels good. It feels buttery smooth, which is what you wanted from the beginning. And also things like performance-wise, like the streaming system, like that does not work well, especially on the base PS4. Lots of pop-in and objects not loading, just horrible stuff. On PS5, running from the SSD, it's almost pretty much a non-issue, and loading times are super, super quick. So the PS5 just kind of brute forces away most of the technical problems, at least performance-wise, and that, you know, that's a big thing.
Good stuff.
But I guess Xbox is up next. So the first thing I did is I did the same drive on Xbox Series X and PS5 in the performance mode. And as you can see, by and large, it's actually extremely comparable between the two while driving around through the city, which is good. And I was like, all right, this is actually a positive thing. Though there was, when I did the runs and just driving around the city on Xbox, I did notice these occasional like huge lurches where the game would just kind of freeze up for a few seconds and then snap back alive, even though it's on the SSD. So everything is not necessarily perfect there. So that is something to note. But I guess the greater problem...
It's kind of weird though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is weird, right? Like, I don't know what's causing it. But then again, the game does have plenty of bugs, as has been discussed. So, you know, could be something related to that. But yeah, that is a difference. But the real difference here, and I couldn't really get like-for-like scenes here, but, you know, I showed this mission earlier on PS5, no problem. Same mission on Series X, and yeah, you're getting lots of dips under 60. Again, not huge drops, but a lot more than you saw on the other machine. So it's not stable there. How about the scene here in this back alley? Run up, start engaging these guys again like I did on PS5, and yeah, it's dipping here as well. Now the club scene, though, that actually does drop on both consoles, so that is, you know, worth noting as well. But basically the point is, by and large, the game does not hold to 60 frames per second as often as the PS5 version.
Right.
That's really what it comes down to.
But we're not looking at entire like-for-like settings on the consoles there, are we?
Exactly. So things like the traffic density, for instance, remain increased on Xbox. So you do get slightly better visuals, I suppose, or at least slight more scene detail on the Xbox. So that might explain why we're seeing some of those dips. But thankfully... if you're okay with 30 FPS, Xbox has you covered, because you get those enhanced visuals, and it pretty much just runs at a stable locked 30 frames per second. Everything I tested, barring the occasional data hitching, was very, very, very stable. And in that sense, I actually think it's probably the best looking way to play the game, just because, obviously you lose frame rate, but you gain a lot of visual clarity and stability that no other console version has. So it's actually not bad. Plus, of course, you get the motion blur, which helps a lot there. So I guess when you look at these two consoles, the choice is pretty much like, if you want 60 frames per second, go for the PS5 version. If you're okay with 30 FPS and you want improved visuals, go for the Series X. It's really that simple for me.
Right.
And I guess Series X also, you have the performance mode if you like. And I guess VRR can help out there as well. So that is worth noting. But it does, it dips pretty hard at points. Series S actually is more consistent, I would say, in terms of that sort of thing. And this is where you played it, as you said. And looking at all the footage and the frame rate stuff you sent me, it is pretty much just a 30 frames per second lock. But there are a couple little moments like here where the game kind of seizes up just a tiny bit for a moment here on the Series S. You get those dips, but again, by and large, it's pretty stable. So, compared to like all the other versions, Series S and Series X at least have a stable 30 frames per second mode, which really isn't an option elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite funny because I know of at least one person who had the PS4 version pre-ordered and has now cancelled that based on the sort of stuff that's coming in about the base versions. Doesn't have a huge amount of money, so has bought an Xbox Series S just to play the game. It's kind of bizarre, but there it is.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, that's kind of the real thing here is, right now, I guess CD Projekt RED, they do have a pretty good track record of patching up their games and greatly enhancing them, because, if we go back to like Witcher 3, it did not run well at launch. It ran pretty bad, actually, on the consoles. It was not great, but they greatly improved it over time, and it's dramatically better now. I suspect we'll see the same thing here, plus the actual next-gen upgrade should arrive in time, and I actually think that's really important in this case, because, again, like, just when I first walked down into the city on all the console versions, you just feel that something's wrong. Like, there was this level of immersion I got when playing the game on PC that was really, really exceptional. It just really pulled me in a big way, and I never felt that playing the console versions. It really is that different, which is fascinating to see.
So this is actually quite interesting here, because what we've got here is actually quite a fascinating 4 teraflop console face-off. Xbox Series S and PS4 Pro. Yeah, I mean, obviously the S is a newer machine, very different architecture generally, but, ballpark similar GPU performance here, and yet with the Series S we seem to be getting a more rounded feature set, thanks to the fact that we've got seemingly very similar settings here overall to Xbox One X's quality mode. And because we've got the solid state storage, because we've got the Zen 2 CPU cluster here, performance is much more consistent. So yeah, it really does seem to be the case that Series S is quite a potent little machine for this game. And it's kind of subverting expectations here, because we went in expecting to get the Xbox One S feature set, but clearly we're getting a lot more here. And I'm really interested to see where they're going to go next with this machine, what they're going to do with the actual proper next-gen version.
It'll be curious to see how it evolves from there. And I guess another thing, I haven't actually encountered too many issues yet, because I haven't played far enough on consoles, mainly just PC, but looking around and talking to people, it seems that there's plenty of crashes happening on these versions, even on the new consoles. There's plenty of bugs, of course. There's still a lot of technical issues with these games, and that is something worth keeping in mind. But still, if you have one of these new consoles, the upgrades are coming, the bug fixes will hopefully arrive. This is one of those cases where you almost have to say, just maybe wait. You can tinker around with the game, but it sounds like it's just going to get better, unless you have a high-end PC right now, in which case, go for it. But if you want to play right now and you have the consoles, what I said before I think stands. If you want that high frame rate, PS5 is probably the best way. If you want better visuals at 30 FPS, then Series X is the best way. And if you want to play it cheaply without with minimal issues, then Series S is pretty good. So
I'm kind of curious about where they're going to go next with the actual next-gen versions, because now users have got 60 frames per second. I don't think they're going to want to upgrade to a version that leaves that out. So I think the next-gen version will have to have a 60 frames per second mode of some description. And then we need to address what CD Projekt Red could do at 30 frames per second. Obviously, once they've left backwards compatibility mode, they have access to the full RDNA 2 feature set. Hopefully we'll get to see more of that deployed. Hopefully much more of the PC experience will make its way over. I mean, if you look at what Series X and PS5 have delivered in relation to PC hardware, they're pretty potent machines, so I'm really hopeful that we will get a really impressive version.
yeah, I'm hopeful as well. And yeah, hopefully they can bring that ray tracing over, because it's kind of a game changer, I'd say. But I guess that's kind of it for this version, or for these versions. Interesting comparison. It's pretty much, as far as I can tell, without having seen the One X version, the next-gen consoles are pretty much the only really, truly playable way to enjoy the game on a console right now, as far as I can tell. So, yeah, I guess there are some definite benefits to owning one of the machines for this game. But I guess that's going to do it, so thanks for joining me, Rich.
Absolute pleasure, John.
And if you guys enjoyed this, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and check out our Patreon if you want to get a direct feed version of the video, though in this case, it can only help so much with that image quality. So, but yeah, until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.